Hi there. There's been a lot of talk recently about transition, about this season being an opportunity to cross over into a new way of doing life and work and church. And in a time of crossing over, there's a need to make sense of the journey so far, the pain, the purpose, the opportunity. We were praying with a bunch of friends recently when a couple of them simultaneously got the story of the crossing of the Jordan in Joshua 4, where God tells Joshua to take up 12 memorial stones from the middle of the Jordan and build an altar to remind future generations of how he made a way for them to cross over the Jordan on dry ground. As we thought about this scripture, it came to us that our personal memorial stones were stories, testimonies of the miracles he had done in our lives in 20 years of leadership and ministry. Healings, salvation, baptisms, miraculous provision. We picked our 12 favourites and made them into a slideshow which we shared with some friends who'd not known us in that era. If you want to know a person, really know a person, it's hard to do that without hearing some of the stories of their life, their triumphs and their tragedies. Therapy very often starts with hearing a story, and usually it's a painful story about a deprived childhood or a difficult marriage or a heartbreaking thing that happened to a child. It's often a story about loss, rejection or betrayal, and the impact it has upon a person. Sometimes simply to tell a story is enough. That's why many people process their stories through writing, a journal or diary where they share their thoughts and experiences, mainly with themselves. But often a story, particularly a difficult story, needs to be witnessed, which is one of the important ideas behind narrative therapy, especially in communities. A story is shared and a witness validates that story by expressing the impact it has had upon them. Because when a story is told, it does have an impact. It changes something in both the teller and the listener. When I think of story, I'm always reminded of E.M. Forster, an early 20th century writer, best known for A Passage to India and Room with a View, who is greatly revered and often quoted on modern creative writing courses. Forster held that storytelling is fundamental to human existence. Here's a quote from aspects of the novel, one of his well-known books. Neanderthal man listened to stories, if one may judge by the shape of his skull. The primitive audience was an audience of shockheads, gaping around the campfire, fatigued with contending against the mammoth or woolly rhinoceros, and only kept awake by suspense. What would happen next? I think someone in Hollywood must have been thinking of that quote when they wrote The Croods. If you've never seen it, do yourself a favour. It's one of those modern kids' movies with a deep philosophical message for the adults. Without any spoilers, the story is about a caveman who has raised his family and survived by the philosophy, always be afraid, it will keep you alive. And his curious, rebellious adolescent daughter who questions the family story, saying, but living in the dark in a cave is not really living at all. And typically, one day a boy and an earthquake arrives to shake it all up. A story is more than a timeline. It's the interaction of character and belief with event and purpose. The story you tell yourself about what happened and why. The meta-story that becomes the filter through which we experience every other story. Sometimes our meta-story clashes with someone else's, and that can be very painful. More often, it clashes with God's meta-story, and that is an existential crisis. Can we carry on believing God's story, or will we try to write our own? The transforming power of the gospel is that it is a story that frames our life story for the better, in this life and in the light of eternity. I've had the privilege on a number of occasions of partnering with a dear friend and colleague, Tyron Akel, to minister healing to people through his timeline technique. In other words, you step out of the timeline of your life to where God sits outside of space and time and hear and see his perspective on it all. The daily challenges and even the present traumas can be processed and become bearable, even transformative, through seeing and hearing what God sees and hears and says about it. In narrative therapy, the therapist is trained to listen for the dominant discourse, which is usually a problem-saturated narrative, and he helps the client to identify what are called unique outcomes. That is, times and occasions when the person or the family somehow managed to do something different. Often a person's life can become dominated by a single story. The story of their failed marriage, their ADD, their anxiety, their grief. And it's the therapist's challenge and privilege to take the thin narrative and thicken it with other times and events, because our life stories are multi-layered. If I allow one narrative to define me, I will be trapped forever in the expectations of that narrative. But I'm more than a single storyline. I'm a complex human being with many sides to my story. That's why the Memorial Stones exercise was such an important exercise for me right now. I could allow my future to be dictated by a recent story that seemed to be full of failures, or I could discover narratives of my life that showed breakthrough, success, and the inbreaking power of God, the value, the purpose that He sees in me. You can always tell when a person is beginning to process grief well when they start to remember the happy times with a family member they've lost, instead of being paralyzed by the sheer blinding pain of the recent bereavement. That is also true of trauma therapy. The aim is not to make the story go away or to forget the trauma, but to put it where it belongs, in the past, as something that happened to me then, but it doesn't constantly invade the present or destroy my relationships in the here and now. On another anniversary occasion, we posted some photos on Facebook, and a good friend from over 30 years ago who'd never been to South Africa, never seen where we lived and worked, saw the post and wrote this encouragement. Never forget the journey. It has been well fought and hard run. Remember your beginning. That is the place of encouragement for other people who may look at what there is now and think that there has been no cost, no ups and downs, no hard times, that you were not at your wits' end at times. He is faithful and true, and God will always see it to completion. As you can imagine, that encouraged me no end, because we can sometimes look at the happy stories of others and imagine that there is or has been no pain. Or we can even look at the sad stories and imagine there's no future promise of happiness or success. The power of story is that which allows us to be real and hopeful at the same time, and above all to be able to connect, because we are all human. Each one of us has a profound story that, if it were told, would bring tears and laughter, admiration, deep sympathy and respect. So perhaps one day you will be brave enough to share your story with someone. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.